Here's what's coming up on the world today. The satisfaction over pension reform boils after French government pushes on with no parliament vote. The satisfaction over pension reforms is boiling after French president pushed on with no vote parliament. Well, fires burned on the streets of Paris as police fired tear gas to disperse protesters following the introduction of an unpopular pensions bill in the French National Assembly. At least one car was burned, along with piles of rubbish and debris in the streets near the place, while some protesters were seen throwing cobblestones and shooting flares at police. According to authorities, at least 217 people were arrested. The demonstration was across the River Seine from Parliament, where Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne earlier announced her government would push through the reform using a special constitution clause. She announced the use of Constitution Article 49(3), which bypasses a vote. The move will ensure the bill raising the retirement age by 2 years to 64 is adopted after weeks of protest and fractious debate. We have VOA's Lisa Bryant joins me now from Paris to discuss more on this. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, how are you?
Very well. The pension overhaul actually raises France's retirement age by 2 years, which is to 64 now, which the government says is essential to ensure that the system does not go or does not burst. Speak to us about this.
Well, the government is saying, look, like many other countries, French are getting older. There's a larger, older population right now, and the worker body is shrinking. And so fairly soon, this retirement, very generous retirement plan that France has for most people is simply not going to be solvable. And that they say this is just way too important to risk a vote in the lower house when it wasn't sure that it was going to pass. So that's their argument. The opposition is saying, hey, right now the pension system is not, in the red, and there are other ways to pay for it. So there are really strong differences, and this is shaping up into one of President Macron's biggest challenges in his new term.
Well, Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne introduced the article, that's the section 49(3) of the Constitution, which is a special power to government. It has to, or it can give a special power to government to force a reform through Parliament without a vote. Obviously, people are not happy about this. What does this mean for President Macron and his government?
It's a problem right now for President Macron and his government. I mean, immediately, the opposition is going to try and table at least one, if not two, no confidence measures on Monday and vote on them. For the moment, it looks like they will likely not pass because the opposition simply doesn't have the votes. However, on the other side, we've got the unions, and the French are taking to the streets, as your images showed so well, and you spoke about it. There's going to be another mass national strike on Thursday, and there are ongoing, smaller strikes. So it's going to be some rocky times for the government and for Mr. Macron.
All right. We know people are angry at the moment because they've been protesting for weeks now, saying they do not want this reform. One can attribute it, of course, to their rage and the fact that government isn't listening. But is government listening to the people right now?
Well, the people will say, no, it's not. I mean, I spoke to some just this afternoon, and they said, they don't take us seriously. We didn't like this, and they rammed this pension reform in anyway. And so we really have a standoff right now between the two sides. How it's going to break, we don't know. It will depend probably on the lasting power of some of the protest movements, on how many votes the opposition is going to be able to get to pass no confidence measures. And a lot of people are looking back a few years ago to the yellow vest protest movements that lasted for months. And, this could be another sort of situation, and it could potentially hobble President Macron and his efforts to try to pass other reforms. And of course, the street is hoping that the government will repeal this pension bill. So we will see what's going to happen. It's very volatile situation.
So it means that you have, there's a likelihood of this protest continuing. As you have said, we know that unions have vowed to maintain their position on the pension changes. Do you see these protests going into weeks and weeks?
I think it will depend on a number of things. First is how much appetite French have to take to the streets and for workers to protest, because every day they are not, at work and striking, they're losing money. And this is coming at a time, of course, of, high inflation. People are tightening their budgets. So it may also be a question of the economy. I think that it's really too difficult to say. We may have one resolution and maybe not, which is we're having thousands of tons of garbage piled on the streets of Paris. It's possible that the garbage strikers may stop on Monday, but again, we don't know. It's a very difficult situation, but yes, there is a possibility this could turn into a new yellow vest movement, in which case this could be weeks or months, as you have suggested.
Been arrested. I mean, over 200 people have been arrested so far. Are you hearing anything from what the government is likely to do to them, or if more people don't just care and they just want to show their anger on the streets in terms of protest?
I think a lot of times when the government arrests these kinds of people, these are the ones that you've had the images that are destroying things, looting and whatever. Usually, I mean, it's sort of petty, criminals that, not even that. I mean, just, small crimes that people are, eventually released after a day or two. I think that right now the government is taking to the airways, the TV channels, et cetera, trying to explain its position. But I don't think the public is buying it right now. I think that, there are some major communications issues. People are saying that real misstep by President Macron. And it's really, really hard to see how this is going to be resolved, at least in the near term.
So for the age now taking to 64 and people not even wanting to know how the parts where Mr. Macron is coming from, in your own opinion, what do you think the situation is like now for the age rising to 64 at the moment? Are there implications for people who are pensioners?
Well, it's interesting to see how older people are responding to this. The current situation for pensioners is that they have a pretty good deal. They have a very generous system, one of the most generous in Europe. France is one of the lowest retirement ages in Europe. The whole argument is we want to keep this intact. And I think for the moment, there's no danger for people who are pensioners in terms of losing, their pensions. The idea that the system is going bust, for the moment, it's intact, as I said before. And the opposition is saying, hey, there are other ways to pay for the retirement system down the road. We could raise taxes on the rich, et cetera. But these are not options that are likely to pass in Parliament. For the moment, one major party that Macron is going to hope to count on, but could not count on for this last vote, is a center-right. It's a party called Les Républicains, and they just, he couldn't get the votes the last time. So it's very interesting, and some of the retired people I've spoken to have two different sets of opinions. Some, are adamantly opposed to this reform, even though they would not be affected. And others say, hey, I can work or I have worked past 62, which is the current retirement age. I'm still alive. Others, this is just reality. We're going to have to bite the bullet.
All right. Thank you very much, Lisa, for your time. VOA's correspondent, Lisa Bryant, thank you for your time on The World Today. Welcome back. You're still watching The World Today on Channels Television. High-ranking officials with the United Nations Population Fund says that women and girls are the most affected and the most in urgent needs of humanitarian aids in quick-hit areas in Turkey. Florence Bauer, UNFPA's Regional Director for Eastern Europe and Central Asia, told reporters in the UN headquarters via video link from Turkey that women in the quake-stricken areas are facing critical situation, as quite a number of them are pregnant or even about to give birth amid the harsh environment. She adds that the agency's urgent priority is to restore services that are crucial to the health and the well-being of women and girls and minimize gender-based violence.
Are of course tremendous. We know that the women and girls are always the most affected, as we know, in this kind of humanitarian situation, and that's of course what's happening here. So UNFPA focus is of course on this particular population, and even more on the ones that are really even amongst women and girls, the ones who are the most vulnerable. So I'm referring to migrants, to refugees, to people with disability, to people who live in a situation of poverty. According to the latest numbers from OCHA, there are 160,000 pregnant women, so we can assess that 18,000 are going to give birth in the next months. And of course, they continue to give birth despite the terrible situation. They even give birth earlier than planned for many of them. So we are providing supplies to the different maternities that have been damaged. Another very important focus that will continue is on gender-based violence, because as I mentioned, we can see and we know, unfortunately by experience, that there is not a single place in the world where gender-based violence is not happening. And we know that this kind of humanitarian situation is going to increase the risk and the number of victims. And we know that many of those services have been strongly affected and destroyed in some cases. So we're also working to ensure that these kind of services are going to be functioning.
The United Nations Security Council has asked Secretary General Antonio Guterres to provide an independent assessment on how to deal with Afghanistan's Taliban administration and combat challenges, including its crackdown on women and girls' rights. It emphasized the importance of the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and upholding human rights, including those of women, children, minors, and persons in vulnerable situations.
A 15-member council unanimously adopted a resolution that requires United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres to submit a report to it in mid-November with forward-looking recommendations for an integrated and coherent approach among relevant political, humanitarian, and development actors within and outside of the United Nations. The Security Council voted to extend the UN's mission in Afghanistan for 1 more year. The Taliban administration, which seized power in August 2021 as US-led forces withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years of war, says it respects women's rights in accordance with its strict interpretation of Islamic law.
The first draft resolution is for a renewal of the robust mandate of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, allowing it to continue its work for another 12 months. Afghanistan faces enormous challenges. The dire humanitarian and economic situation is compounded by Taliban's decisions that deny opportunities for education, employment, and freedom to women and girls. The threat of terrorism also persists. All of these have a devastating impact on the people of Afghanistan.
But the Taliban has banned women and girls from attending high school and university, visiting parks, and working for aid groups. Women are also not allowed to leave the home without a male relative and must cover their faces.
This comes at a critical time when the people of Afghanistan faced a dire social, political, economic, and humanitarian crisis due to the Taliban's failure to address the current crisis, break the impasse, and engage constructively to respond to national and international calls for fair, responsible, inclusive system of governance, policies that respect human rights, rightful inclusion of women in all aspects of society, and counter-terrorism efforts. All things that they promised to the world and to the people of Afghanistan.
The United Arab Emirates UN ambassador Lana Nusaybi said the status quo is not sustainable.
We're all aware that the situation in Afghanistan is extremely challenging and that our options are actually very limited, but the status quo is not sustainable. So by requesting this independent assessment, the Council is taking a careful and measured response to a difficult crisis with outside expertise and fresh thinking, and essentially saying that a business-as-usual approach is not sufficient to Afghanistan. And I think that was the main message coming out of the Council today.
Meanwhile, representatives from the United States and United Kingdom speak on the need to protect and monitor the rights of all Afghans.
The Council's action today is timely, particularly amid Women's History Month, and as we convene the 67th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. The Council's action directly supports the empowerment of women and girls, their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and their full, equal, and meaningful participation in all levels and stages of decision-making.
Today's unanimous decision to renew UNAMA's robust mandate sends a clear message. The international community will not abandon women and girls. The work of the mission in protecting, promoting and monitoring the rights of all Afghans, including advocating for inclusive and representative governance, is more important than ever. And through it, we will work to hold the Taliban to account on its commitments.
On her part, Russia's Deputy Representative Anna Esteneva is hopeful that the mission will fulfill its commitment in full.
It's important not to allow Afghanistan to be isolated. Constructive and patient dialogue will benefit everyone. We believe that the mission will continue fulfilling its obligations in full, including coordinating international humanitarian assistance in the country.
In all, the Security Council expressed concerns in the resolution at the lack of progress made by the Taliban on its expectations. It is also worthy of mention that the United Nations has made its single largest country aid appeal ever, asking for $4.6 billion in 2023 to deliver help in Afghanistan, where it says 2/3 of the country's population, that's some 28 million people, need the aid to survive.
The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank in the United States have sent shockwaves through the global markets. In Europe, for example, Credit Suisse is now the first global banking giant to feel the heat from the uncertainty in the banking sector. Despite a swift intervention by Switzerland National Bank to avert a larger banking crisis, the turmoil in Europe hasn't fully dissipated yet. We have DW correspondent Andrea Nepore in Berlin to tell us more on this matter. Hello, Andrea. As on the Credit Suisse, is the bank safe now or is it still at risk of collapsing? What do you have for us?
Well, as of today, the situation is much better. It seems like the risk of a collapse has been almost fully averted. And the most important measure for that was the credit lifeline that the Swiss National Bank extended to Credit Suisse between Wednesday and Thursday. It's a $54 billion loan that, of course, was able to assuage the investors and the depositors' worries about the bank's liquidity. At the same time, the FINMA, the main regulator in Switzerland, put out a very strong statement already on Wednesday saying that the bank is stable enough. It meets all the criteria for systemically relevant banks in terms of liquidity and credit. So these measures were, of course, meant to restore confidence and trust in the bank. They seem to have worked. The bank sort of regained most of the losses from Wednesday. At the same time, let's also remember that Credit Suisse is undergoing a strong restructuring right now, also before the crisis already, and that's also seen as an important move to ensure the bank's long-term stability. So all in all, I would say it's going much better than a few days ago.
Years of a larger contagion to other European banks.
Well, you know, any bank is potentially at risk if enough people at the same time coordinate to pull out their money, right? It's a bank run. That's how the system works. But of course, it comes down to confidence and trust, as I mentioned. And in the case of Credit Suisse, that's what was lacking. In the global turmoil of the banking system, it was inevitable that a weak player like Credit Suisse would be seen as the weak link here in Europe. And that's exactly what happened. So let's say it was not unexpected that Credit Suisse would feel the heat from the current situation. At the same time, other banks are not in the same conditions. Let's also remember, Credit Suisse lost more than $7 billion last year. It was riddled with scandals. There was already a lot going on when it comes to mismanagement of the bank. Other banks in Europe are doing better. Their financial health is better. They're in general in a better position. The risk is, of course, there because, I don't know, we could say also short sellers and speculators. At the same time, the ECB, the European Central Bank, reassured everyone saying the system is safe and is resilient. Fears are still there. It was a very complicated week for banks and business reporters alike, but I would say that the outlook is much better than it was 1 week ago.
Well, Andrea, we know there's been interventions and so on, but on a wider note, or generally speaking, what are the effects of the current turmoil in Europe's economic policy?
Well, the ECB, of course, acknowledged the problems, so they're watching the market tension closely. But yesterday, they needed to decide of a new interest rate hike, and they decided to stick with the plan. And they increased the rates of 50 basis points. We're now up to 3% interest rate here in the Eurozone. And the reason for that, the ECB explained, is that inflation is expected to stay high for too long. So the only surefire way to take care of that problem is to keep raising interest rates. Now, higher interest rates are not the best for banks, which of course are invested in long-term interest-related products, but the ECB believes that they can stand the heat, they can stand a longer period of higher interest rates, whereas inflation is the main priority. ECB also said that they will be of course quick to intervene in case of liquidity problems or other sign of a crisis.
Thank you very much, DW correspondent Andrea Nepori, talking to us from Berlin, Germany. Thanks for your time on The World Today. Two other stories now. Bilateral relations, where South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol said that he will take a bit more courage to make good friends and a better future with Japan. He made the comments during his Tokyo trip to hold a rare summit with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida to fix their frayed ties. Mr. Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister promised a reset in relations and dined on omelets served over rice. The strain between the two neighbors and the U.S. allies have been deepening concern for the United States, which of course wants to present a united front against China's rising power and the threats from North Korea's expanding missile program. Unions representing healthcare workers in England agreed a final pay offer, with the British government potentially bringing an end to some strikes affecting the state-run National Health Service, the NHS. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been under growing pressure to quell the worst run of workers' unrest in the country since the 1980s, with strikes affecting almost every aspect of the normal life, from healthcare to transport and schools and even to border checks. But shortly after Health Secretary Stephen Barclay completed negotiations, he and Mr. Sunak visited St. George's Hospital in South London, where they enthusiastically discussed the offer with staff.
I'm delighted that the government has reached agreement with unions representing over 1 million NHS workers on a fair and reasonable pay settlement. This agreement rightly recognises the fantastic work that our NHS workers like nurses, midwives and paramedics do, whilst also being affordable for the taxpayer and allowing us to deliver on our promises to halve inflation and cut NHS waiting lists. It's a good example of this government getting things done and delivering for the British people? No, absolutely not. We are going to be making sure that we protect all frontline services with £14 billion of more funding that we announced at the end of last year. No one can doubt our commitment to making sure that the NHS is well funded. That will always remain the case. And we've got a great plan in place to make improvements. And you're already seeing the results of that plan. In fact, if you look at ambulance waiting times or waiting times in A&E, they're already improving considerably from a couple of months ago. And we're on track to keep bringing the waiting list down. And with this pay agreement, now everyone is going to be united behind that, and we can deliver really fantastic quality care for patients up and down the country. That's what everyone in the NHS wants to do. They're being backed fully to the hilt to deliver it, and I look forward to doing that for the country. We want to have constructive dialogue with unions. We're serious about finding fair and reasonable agreements on public sector pay. I think today's agreement demonstrates that. And what I'd say to all other unions is, please don't be striking. Please come in and have those talks. We've been wanting to do that, and today's agreement demonstrates we're serious about it. We don't want disruption for patients. We don't want disruption for school children in our classrooms. So, please come and get around the table. I'm confident we can find a way through this. Today's agreement demonstrates we're serious about this, and we can find workable solutions. The number one challenge with the cost of living is inflation, and particularly with energy bills. So if there's one measure from the budget that I'd ask people to kind of take away with them, it's our continued plan to support people with the cost of energy. Now, what we did last year is made a decision to tax the windfall profits of energy companies and to use that money to help cut people's energy bills. And because of the actions we've taken, people are going to receive £1,500 of direct support off their energy bills last year in this. That's the right thing to do. And if there's one thing you take away from the budget, it's that this government is doing everything it can to help you with the cost of your energy bills. And that's what we will continue doing.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has announced $150 million in new humanitarian aid to Sahel region to assist Africa's region, saying that it will provide life-saving support to refugees and others impacted by flood, by conflict and food insecurity. Making this announcement during his visit to Niger, Blinken said that aid will address needs in Niger, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali and Mauritania. The package also includes funding to support Sahelian refugees in Libya and in Niger.
Today, I announced nearly $150 million in new humanitarian assistance to help meet needs in West and Central Africa and the Sahel created by regional instability. That assistance will support the provision of shelter, essential health care, emergency food, safe drinking water, sanitation, hygiene services, and will also support vulnerable refugees and asylum seekers evacuated to Niger. And I have to say, the generosity of Niger, of its people, to so many refugees, so many displaced persons, is remarkable. We're committed to continuing to invest in the resilience of democracies to a wide range of threats and challenges, from corruption to disinformation. And we continue to support a free and independent press, as we have done in Niger for decades.
And over in northwest Tanzania, where at least 5 people have been killed from an unidentified illness. 7 cases have so far been reported in Kagera region, and authorities have dispatched a team of doctors to diagnose the disease. Health authorities in the East African country have described the illness, which exhibits symptoms of fever, headaches, fatigue, and nosebleeds, as strange. Its symptoms include, according to the government's chief medical officer, Tumaini Nagu, residents in the area have been advised to avoid contact with infected people. In July last year, more than 20 cases with similar symptoms were reported in the southern Lindi region, and 3 people died from that outbreak. Investigations later identified the disease as leptospirosis, also known as Wales disease. At Machuria village in Malawi's Chiradzulu district, some survivors of tropical Cyclone Freddy are sheltered in a school, and that's after a landslide and flooding swept away their homes. Apart from needing psychological care for traumatic incidents, families are also in need of sustenance.
Survivors say they can still hear the screams of people caught in the flooding and landslide.
It will be hard to go back to that place in peace, because what we heard and saw then will always be in our minds. You feel like you can still hear people screaming. It's really frightening because we are living under the mountains, and it will always remind us of the water coming from there.
Another survivor calls for food, clothing and bedding to be sent to the victims.
We need food, clothes and bedding. It is hard to survive without food. And if possible, we would like to find a place where we can build new homes.
The storm has now dissipated, but according to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Climate Change, heavy rains are expected to continue in parts of Malawi and will likely cause more floods around lakeshore areas. Tropical Cyclone Freddy has killed more than 400 people in Malawi, Mozambique and Madagascar since it first made landfall in Africa in late February and circled back to hit the region for a second time over the weekend. Freddy is one of the longest-lasting tropical cyclones ever recorded and one of the deadliest in Africa.
Welcome back. 12 out of 15 soldiers have been found guilty for raping minors in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and this followed several weeks of hearings in the courts. In a court in Kamayola, one soldier was discharged dishonorably for raping a 14-year-old girl. At least 8 people have been killed after the roof of a potato cold storage building collapsed in northern India. The accident took place in the Chandusi area in Sahel city of Uttar Pradesh, and that's after national and state emergency services were deployed to carry out search and rescue operations. Police were present at the site while rescuers and excavators cleared piles of potatoes to look for bodies and survivors. Building collapses are commonplace in India, especially during the seasonal monsoon rains. Over in Colombia, where 10 miners reported missing after an explosion caused an accumulated gas have been found dead, raising the death toll to 21. The explosion in several adjoining coal mines took place in the rural area of Sultan Tausa, and that's about 75 kilometers north of Bogota. The National Mining Agency said activities at the mines have been suspended, and investigations to establish the cause of the explosion will take place before reopening can be considered. Serious accidents are common at open pits and subterranean coal and gold mines in Colombia, mostly at illegal or informal operations and those without proper safety measures.
Prohibió el paso de motos. Cuidado.
Finally, a ceremony to mark the return of hundreds of stolen accident artifacts and jury prize pieces to Cambodia was held at the Peace Palace in the nation's capital today. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen attended the ceremony in Phnom Penh to give blessings for the stolen artifacts, which were returned primarily from the United States and the United Kingdom. Among the repatriated artifacts was a 10th century sandstone statue depicting the Hindu god of war Skanda riding on a peacock, which was sold to Western buyers in the year 2000 by Douglas Latchford, who was a British art dealer based in Bangkok, who created fake documents to conceal the fact that the item had been looted and smuggled. The Southeast Asian country archaeological sites, including Koher, an ancient city of Khmer Empire, suffered widespread looting and civil conflicts between 1960s and 1990s. Cambodia's government has since sought to repatriate stolen artifacts sold on the international market. And that's it on The World Today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Anne Umawadu. Have a wonderful weekend.